Welcome back to another episode of the Tommy Brideson Show. I want to talk about rehab programs and why they have a permanent place within your actual training program themselves. Now, when we look at like training and rehab, they're essentially the same thing. Rehab is looking at something, or prehab is looking at something from sort of a bottoms up view, and you're looking at your training and you're building the smaller components up towards training. But then when you have a look at, training and coaching, you're taking a top sort of bird eyes view down, and you're going, well, I want to sort of work back from a certain quality. How do I get to that particular point? But, I often have this conversation with a lot of people, and I honestly believe that coaching's rehab, rehab is coaching, because they're the same thing. They're getting to like a common goal of training, and they're getting to that common goal of, making progress forward, but they just come in it from a slightly different angle. So, there needs to be a really good communication between coaches and practitioners, or find someone that really understands movement and coaching at the same time to sort of get that really nice synergy. Now, when we look at rehab in general, it's often seen as like a reactive tool. And what I mean by that is, you pop up with an injury, you get a niggle, you get some pain, and then it's at that particular point that you actually book in a rehab session with your practitioner or your massage therapist or whoever you're seeing. And the reality is, what we need to start to do is look at rehab as literally being part of the actual training process itself. We can't just look at rehab as, something reactively that fixes you once you've had an injury. We need to be looking at it of like, well, how do we continue to do the thing that we want to do? How do we continue to progress towards our goal in a way that we're minimizing our risk of injury, and we're minimizing our downtime away from training, from the thing that we really want to do. So, there's quite a few different strategies as to how you can have it in your actual training week. It doesn't have to be like in the form of getting like a weekly treatment session with a physio or a chiro. Don't get me wrong, that stuff's really, really helpful, but there's a lot of other means that you can do as well and have it within your training week, so that you're still ticking the boxes, you're still working in a way that's really proactive and not sort of, you're hitting things head on. You're making sure that you're not sort of waiting for something to happen, which is really important to do, especially if, training is something that you do and you want to continue to make progress for a substantial amount of time. Now, probably the easiest way to look at, ways that you can have it in your training program is actually using your training session itself through the week as a form of prehab as well as training. So you've got a couple of opportunities there. And, the first one is actually your warm-up programs itself. Now, when we think about warming up with training sometimes, there's different trains of thought. Some people say, if you work on mobility or you work on movement pre-training, it can be detrimental to your strength. But, you've got the other side where it's like, if you're actually fighting your position and you can't get into the position that you're trying to get into for, training session, like say you can't get in squat position, there's resistance against yourself. So you're fighting yourself to get into the position. So your warm-up program is just such a good opportunity to work as an active prehab program. Now, some non-specific rolling, like getting on a foam roller, and actually, everyone has tight spots. Everyone has spots that basically do a lot of work. And the problem with this is that when they get really, really bundled up and really, really tight, they can actually start to limit movement, and they can start to limit, your ability to actually get into positions that you need during training. So starting off with some trigger point where you're, say working through your hips, working through your glutes to make sure that you have the available range of movement. And you're also just warming up the actual tissue itself. Getting the tissue warm enough, getting some extensibility in the tissue is such a great thing to do. And you start off with that because it's non-specific, but it's specific in terms of movement, but then you transition it into drills that are actually going to help then the training session ahead. But, something with that is you've got to note that, I have this conversation with a lot of people, is the warm-up programs that we do is almost like prehab for the actual training program itself. So you're warming up in a way and you're getting ready for the session at hand. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's actually going to be, prehab for general movement and general life. It's prehab for that particular session. Now, don't get me wrong, if you have an injury or something like that, yes. But the reality is you're setting your body up and you're getting things ready to execute a particular training session. So it's prehab for the session. This is something that I sort of, always like to point out for people. But once you've moved past like the foam rolling and the trigger point, you can move into a bit more of a structured warm up where, you're warming up the areas that you're going to use in your training session. You can, potentially upregulate some of the weak points if you've had any that are identified, and bring them up so that they can do a little bit more work as you transition into, say, warming up with the barbell itself. So, that in itself is just such a great way to actually have an inbuilt prehab program into your actual training, is using your warm up effectively and, not just brushing it off and going, oh, well, I've got, 60 minutes or 90 minutes, I'm not going to do any warm ups. So, if you fall into that category, there's so many strategies that you can do, but one of the easiest ways to do it is, I would actually come in, and if you're really crunched for time, get your foam rolling, get your trigger point out of the way, come in, get everything moving well. And then as you're starting to warm up your exercises, say for instance, you're doing a back squat, as you're warming up with the squat itself, you might do the bar, you might do 40, you might 60, you might do 80. In between each one of those sets that you do as you're warming up, add in a couple of the warm-up exercises itself. So it doesn't need to be a whole process at the front end of the training session if you don't have time or if you don't enjoy it that way. You can actually start to integrate it into the barbell itself or whatever exercise that it is. So there's ways that you can save time. You can be a bit more time efficient and, just make sure that you're almost like, we call them fillers, but you're filling in your rest period with a warm-up drill or some sort of prehab based exercise. So using your warm-up is just such a good way. If you're not fighting yourself and you're not, struggling to get into positions for training, there's going to be a lot less resistance. The muscles the structures that want to work are going to have a better chance of actually, and a better opportunity of doing what they want to do and contribute to the actual exercise itself. So by default, that's like an inbuilt prehab program. So the warm-up programs definitely shouldn't be skipped. And, I think as a newer lifter into the gym as well, what will happen is, sometimes you don't feel like you need a warm-up as such. As you start to progress and you start to get better, you start to build up more tension in the system from building strength, building muscle mass, the warm-ups become even more important. I would say more so sort of that newer lifter, it's more awareness. It's more of that feedback of body parts of, it's up-regulating things so you can start to use them and group them together. Whereas when you start to get into that sort of intermediate and advanced range, we're actually just optimizing movement to make sure that you can continue to get into those positions itself without any resistance. Now, if we move into the actual training session itself, so if we look, I've talked about it previously about like different approaches to training, looking at, percent-based programming, looking at RPE-based programming. Now, if we look at training as a whole, there is always an overarching RPE associated with everything. And what we want to start to do is, even if you have got a training program that's like a fixed percentage, you have an RPE that's inbuilt that's based on effort. So say I had 100 kilos for bench press programmed, but I'm doing 100 kilos and I'm meant to do a set of 5 and I do a set of 2 and I'm like redlining. I'm clearly just going to rack that up because the risk reward for that particular set is too high. And because I have an inbuilt, RPE system within my training, I'm just going to scale it back 5 or 10% and then continue on with my work sets and see if that's closer to, the rep range with intensity that I've been prescribed. So say it's been an 8 RPE or it's been 70% or 80%. I want to be getting closer to that 7, 8 RPE. So having an inbuilt RPE within your training program itself is, but not just like absolute intensity, having an overarching, like, am I able to hold this position well? Can I do it in a way that, I'm still in control of the movement? Like my muscles are loading, I'm in control of the position. I'm not being thrown around, by the way, and just getting it done. It's a very active movement because there's a really big difference between, like let's use squat, for example. If you dive bomb into a squat and use the momentum out of the hole, sure, you can get out of it. In a lot of cases, you'll get the timing right, you'll get the momentum right, and you'll be able to stand the squat back up. But what you might actually find is, if you control the weight more instead of sort of using more of a stretch reflex, you get a lot more consistency and you get a lot more feedback as to, how much weight or how many more reps you can push because you're in control. It's a really active movement. So it's not just kind of relying on heart. It's actually, you can feel it and you can build tension into it and when you should increase and decrease, right? So Using your training program and not overshooting in your actual training program. Like if you've got a prescribed 8 RPE, actually hit an 8 RPE, or, be cautious leading up to your top sets and sort of just not overshooting the gun and then being, oh, like I hit a 9.5, whatever, and then back off and do back off sets. Because if you're constantly redlining things in your training program itself, you're getting yourself, the risk reward's just not the same. Like, you're just pushing way too hard, way too often. And it's like, for what? You're kind of exposing yourself to, a potential injury, which, again, sort of defeats the purpose of being in the game for a longer period of time. Now, when we're looking at your actual training sessions themselves, what we want to also be thinking about doing is, as you get better and better, and as you get stronger, as you build more muscle mass, you're probably going to have some times that are dedicated to actually just offsetting some of the tension that you actually create during your training sessions. Now, the tension we create is actually good. We're trying to stiffen up the system. We're trying to build more muscle mass. But the flip side of that is as well, as you get better at these things, you then also need to give back a little bit as well. Like you need to offset some of that work you do. It's not just work, and then give nothing back. So even having a couple of dedicated sessions during the week where it's really non-specific. It's just stretching. It's just mobility. It's just working on, restoring some range of movement. Now, that is always a trade-off with any sort of sport, right? There's function and there's normal baseline movement, but then there's also like the requirements that you need for your sport. So if you look at, powerlifting, it's a really extension, externally rotated style pattern that we sort of, go into over and over and over again. But when you get stuck in those real small windows of movement, anything outside of that is actually what becomes quite, injury prone because you haven't trained it. You've been training in the complete opposite. So, these movement-based sessions is basically getting exposure back to movements that you're not training during your training program. Now, you can try and get creative with like exercise selection and, offsetting the extension with your accessory exercises. But there's a point in time where you've just got to go all in. So if you want to improve on your squat, you need to do things that are going to improve on your squat. So then you can add in some sessions that essentially help to offset, some of the work that you're essentially doing. Now, the other one is actually just, probably the most obvious is looking at training technique. I think this is something that, the longer in your game, the longer you are in the game in terms of training, the more and more it becomes relevant. Like it's relevant from word go, but you can make so much progress and you can reduce your risk of injury so much just by working on good training technique. And, that could be a hack squat, leg press, rear foot elevated split squat. It doesn't matter what movement. There's always continual progress to be made in all of these. Can you load the tissue better? Can you get a better range of movement? Can you continue to progress on those lifts? And by doing that, that is also by default an inbuilt prehab program. Now, moving away from the actual training session itself and, sessions around it, if we look at like your day-to-day, for instance, what are you doing outside of training that can really kind of push you forward in terms of prehab? So one of them is obviously booking in and getting treatment from a practitioner. But the other big one is, adequate nutrition, adequate hydration, and making sure that you're actually getting enough sleep and recovery. Like if you're severely underfed, but you're expecting your body to perform at a high level, there's a little bit of a mismatch in your recovery versus your actual training itself. Right? Like if you speak to anyone that's been in an extended period of time when they're in a deficit, when they're losing weight, for instance, they're not going to feel great and they will be able to feel the lack of energy in their training sessions. So if you're going into a training session and you're expecting to, be having the best session of your life, but you're in a severe deficit of calories, you have to sort of try and pair them up a little bit better. And, I think the smartest approach is for someone that's really active in the gym is finding baseline, finding what your maintenance is. And then it's very easy to sort of go up and down where need be, but what your baseline is. For me personally right now, it's 3,000 calories. If I sit there, I don't increase or decrease weight, for instance. And I think once you've got your calories sorted, it's very easy to then add layers into your nutrition. I would say calories is the overarching ruler, and then you would work on protein. Are you making sure that, you're assisting your body to grow and recover with enough protein? Then I would look at, getting enough fat in. A general rule of thumb is just a gram per kilo of body weight. And then you would fill the rest in with carbohydrate. So it's a really simple way of looking at it. Once you've got a really good system on that, then you can actually start to look at different types of food choices. You can start to go, okay, am I hitting my micronutrients? Am I getting enough nutritional value from the food that I'm eating? But if you try and do everything at once, it sometimes can get a little bit overwhelming, but start to build a little bit of a system up for yourself where it's like, okay, I make sure I eat enough food. And then you tailor the rest as you go on. You don't have to hit everything on the head. But nutrition is obviously one of the biggest drivers of body composition, of energy and performance in your actual training sessions themselves. Now, in terms of, hydration, I think with the accessibility of like soda drinks and, all of that, I'm not here to demonize any of that, but, if you're sitting there and, you're grabbing a can of Coke before you grab, a bottle of water when you're thirsty, maybe rejigging that around a little bit and getting your hydration level sorted before you add something else into the system. With carbohydrates, for instance, when you ingest it, you take it into the system, it takes water in with it. So if you're hydrated and then you have a sugary drink on top of that, you're actually further pushing yourself into a dehydrated state, which really doesn't, assist that. So, having something with some sodium, some electrolytes in it can be really beneficial. Moving into the obvious of sleep is, just making sure that you get adequate sleep every single night. Now, it's a busy time and, I am, first and foremost guilty of that. But I have minimum requirements that I expect of myself so that I can perform. And it is 6 hours. It's better on 7, but the gold standard is 8 hours. But for everyone's life, it's going to be slightly different, but you've got to try and maximize the amount of recovery that you can get. And sleep is one of those huge factors. I think anyone that's competing at a high level will often have micro naps during the day as well. They'll often have, little 15 or 30-minute breaks during the day just to, help and assist that recovery, especially if you've had a really big training session or, you've potentially not had the best sleep the night before. It's just a really powerful tool that you could use just to give yourself a little bit more energy and, help improve on that recovery. Then moving into the treatment side of things. So having a practitioner that you work with is so important. I think anyone, working at a high level, having someone that really understands your body type, that you can continue to develop on is really important. Like everyone will have sort of default stress patterns that they move towards. So if you've got someone that's, really quad dominant, for instance, they'll have areas that build up tension. And, when you get that relationship going with a practitioner, it's not a cookie cutter type approach, but you'll know that every single session, even if you're not in, a state where you're in a sensitized state where you have an injury, you might actually have, some time just to work on restoring or offsetting some of these tension spots that you develop during your training. And, sometimes, your pain by itself is actually just a result of these tension spots. So having a practitioner sort of, gets your body, understands like the type of training that you're doing as well, that's really important. Having someone that really kind of, understands the requirements of the sport. Like, perfect example, powerlifting. If I was competing tomorrow and then I had a treatment session booked in today, I wouldn't want someone to go too hard on me and try and fix anything or try and restore any range of movement, because that's actually then taking away tension from my system that I actually need the following day. So you need someone that sort of gets the requirements of what you're doing. Like even, around scheduling of sessions and stuff like that. Myself with my guys, I'll try and sort of plan it around like a deload week or a week 1 for like the heavier sessions or the more intensive treatment sessions. And then, towards the back end, say it's a 6-week block and it's 5 weeks of ramping up and then deload, I'm probably not going to treat someone on week 5 just because there's so much stress in the system already. Like they're already, they're pushing up either the volume or they're pushing up the intensity of the actual the lifts, the most of that entire block. So there's already so much stress and I don't really want to add to that. And I also don't want to then further destabilize the system, because once you start to mess with that, it starts to then change techniques. Things might not feel as strong. And then that also potentially exposes you to, a risk of injury as well, because your movement patterns start to change. So you've got to be careful with the timing. And I think, building up a relationship with the practitioner is such an important thing of, continuing to push forward, because they'll know what to treat, when to treat, and how to treat you. And more so, you'll be more comfortable with that person, and you'll be more comfortable and open in terms of your communication about how you feel and how you relay that to the practitioners. Because, we take a lot of information, like being a practitioner, I'll take a lot of information from the person in front of me that I'm speaking to, because quite often they're actually telling the story. So you can do all the diagnostic tests that you want, and it's definitely going to help with your treatment. But, getting that feedback, like where does that hurt? What provokes it? At what point of the day? The conversations that you have, you actually get so much from. So having that open communication with your practitioner allows them to then continually build on the type of treatment that you get. And, for my lifters and the people that I work with, I'll also then assist their treatment with, prehab programs. And those prehab programs are either, they might be on their off training days, like I was speaking about before. And it's like more of a, like a general flush out, restoring range of movement, specific to them. Or I might interject and say, hey, for the next bit of time, can you throw in this particular program to help you warm up for your squats, for instance? It's going to help do X, Y, and Z. But, that's something that's developed over time. You don't get that in one session. So if you're constantly chopping and changing and, going to a different practitioner, one practitioner might say, hey, you've got an injury, rest, where, someone that really understands your sport and the demands of what you're doing is like, oh no, this is just actually a little niggle. We're going to work around this a little bit and then, figure out a bit of a plan. Like, yeah, sure, there may be a decrease in volume and intensity for a little bit if there is something going on. But this is what's going to get you back to 100%. And active rest isn't that in pretty much all instances. You know what I mean? So, having that open relationship with your practitioner is a really helpful thing to progressing your prehab and also your training forward. So, as someone that's really active, it doesn't matter what you train for. If you're a long distance, endurance athlete, you're a strength athlete, you just want to build muscle, or you actually just want to improve on your lifestyle, you have to have inbuilt buffers into your training programs and your training weeks that help you to stay in the game and continue to push forward. For someone that's actually just doing training for a lifestyle approach, training actually may be that. But the further you get down into, the specificness of, aerobic training, strength training, building muscle mass, you're going to have to do more and more and more to offset that during the week. So, to wrap things up, I'm a really big believer that, rehab is coaching and coaching is rehab. They're seen from a slightly different lens. And, the rehab is really sort of movement quality and optimizing. And you are doing that from the coaching perspective as well, but you're really trying to get an outcome. So it's the synergy of those two things together that is actually going to get the best outcome for you. It's going to keep you in the game for longer training, which means you're going to be able to make more progress over time, and you're going to be at a huge position of strength because you're going to be able to stack up your training weeks on week, on week, on week, and you're going to get so much more progress other than sort of ramping up, getting an injury, and then having to take a week off. So you really want to have these strategies built into your actual training weeks to continue to push forward. And that's it from me today. I'll see you guys on the next episode.